The saloons of the Old West. You see them in the movies, right? A lone rider pushes through those swinging doors. The piano stops, everyone goes quiet, and all eyes turn to the stranger. A scene of adventure, heroic duels, and a certain glamour. But, my dear, what if I told you that almost all of that is pure invention? The truth, you see, was much dirtier, rougher, less about shootouts and more about an overwhelming filth you just couldn't escape. Today I'm going to lift the veil on that Hollywood fantasy and tell you the shocking truth about the saloons of the Old West. And believe me, they were filthier than you can imagine. First, forget about those grand wooden buildings you see on screen. The first saloons, my friend, were nothing more than temporary structures. Think of a new mine or a small railroad town. The saloon was the first thing to show up. Sometimes, it was just a rough tent, a sod house, or a shack made from whatever scraps of wood they could find. As the town grew, these things gave way to simpler wooden buildings, often with a false front to make them look bigger than they really were. It was an attempt to show some stability in a world that had none. Only in the most prosperous towns, like Deadwood or Tombstone, would you find the more elaborate saloons. But the first thing you'd notice when you walked in, and I guarantee this, was the smell. It was a thick, foul cocktail of stale beer, cheap whiskey, dirty bodies, and heavy tobacco smoke. Every time the door opened, a new wave of dust and manure from the unpaved street would come in. The sounds were different, too. Music was a luxury. The main sounds were the low murmur of conversations, punctuated by the dry coughs of sick men. Visually, the place was simply filthy. The floors were rough wood, covered with a layer of sawdust to soak up spills and tobacco spit, creating a perpetually damp and dirty surface. The bar was sticky, and the whole place was dimly lit by kerosene lamps that gave off smoke. Even the iconic swinging doors weren't for dramatic entrances, they were for ventilation, believe it or not. And it wasn't just the smell, no. The Old West saloon was dirty in the most literal sense of the word, turning these crowded places into real breeding grounds for deadly diseases. The threats inside were often invisible, but far more dangerous than any shootout. For ordinary people on the frontier, taking a bath was a huge and rare task. Water had to be carried by hand and heated over a fire. In a typical family, everyone washed in the same basin of water, starting with the father and ending with the youngest child. By the end, the water was cold and dirty. Oral hygiene was just as bad. People used knives to pick food out of their teeth. If a tooth got infected, the local barber or blacksmith would pull it out with pliers and a shot of whiskey for the pain. The towns themselves were just as unsanitary. There were no sewage systems, and trash was simply dumped outside the town. All this filth was constantly tracked into the busy saloon. This environment was a paradise for pests like lice, flies, and cockroaches. This perfect combination of poor hygiene, lack of sanitation, and pests made the saloon an incredibly efficient place for the spread of disease. Cholera could sweep through a saloon thanks to shared, dirty glasses. Tuberculosis spread easily in the closed, smoke-filled rooms. Smallpox, another highly contagious virus, would also spread like wildfire. In fact, you were much more likely to die from a disease caught in a saloon than from a bullet. Think about that, and the whiskey. Oh man, the whiskey. Besides the physical and biological filth, there was another kind of nastiness that flowed freely, the drink itself. The whiskey cowboys drank was rarely that smooth, aged bourbon you might imagine. Most of the time, it was a disgusting and dangerous mix, known by names like Coffin Varnish, Tarantula juice, or rot gut. Real aged whiskey was a rare luxury. To meet the demand for cheap liquor, saloon owners made fake drinks. The base was usually raw, cheap grain alcohol. To turn this into whiskey, they would add burnt sugar for color and a chunk of chewing tobacco to give it a kick with a dose of nicotine. But the most alarming ingredients were the poisonous chemicals. Fake bourbon recipes called for additives like turpentine and creosote, or wood preservative. The final product was a harsh liquid that could make a person violently ill. The name rot gut was a literal description of its effect. And it wasn't just one or two isolated cases, no. It was a widespread industry with almost no government regulation. Even the beer was a disappointment. Without refrigeration, it was served at room temperature, often flat and stale, and just like the whiskey, it was sometimes adulterated with narcotics to make it seem stronger. A real trap, if you ask me. Now, about vice and violence, it wasn't like in the movies. No, the saloon's reputation as a den of iniquity was deserved, but the reality was much less glamorous than what we see on screen. First, that classic bar fight, that widespread and chaotic brawl, is almost entirely a creation of the movies. The real violence in the saloon was sporadic, personal, and much more deadly. Usually, it was a quick, brutal, and fatal encounter between 2 or 3 men over a gambling dispute or an insult. Recognizing this danger, many towns required customers to leave their weapons at the door. This simple form of gun control ensured that most arguments were settled with fists, not bullets. Gambling was the main form of entertainment. There were honest, respected gamblers who built a reputation for integrity, and there were traveling cheats who took advantage of newcomers with marked cards and other tricks. The role of women is also often misunderstood. There was a difference between saloon girls and prostitutes. Saloon girls were performers. Their job was to sing, dance, and chat with lonely customers to keep them buying drinks. For many women, this was a path to financial independence. Prostitution was a separate line of work and much more dangerous. And finally, not everyone was welcome. Contrary to the image of a lawless place of total freedom, the saloon was actually a highly structured environment with rigid, unwritten rules and clear lines of exclusion. The saloon was the social center of the frontier for white men. It was where cowboys, miners, lawmen, and outlaws could meet. The line between a lawman and an outlaw was often surprisingly thin. However, this melting pot had well-defined boundaries. A respectable woman would never set foot in a saloon. Racial exclusion was also the rule. Native Americans and Chinese immigrants were not welcome. Although black men were a significant part of the West, they were also often excluded from white saloons and established their own. A surprisingly excluded group was the U.S. Army soldier. Many regulars at the saloon felt a natural disdain for the uniform and the authority it represented. Within the accepted group of patrons, behavior was governed by a strict code. Privacy was fundamental. You never asked personal questions about a man's past, and a powerful custom was the obligation to buy a round of drinks. Refusing an offered drink was a terrible insult. So, my dear, the romanticized Hollywood saloon is pure fiction. The historical truth is that the real saloon was a center of disease, raw, filthy, and with a horrible smell. It served poisoned drinks to a select clientele, governed by rigid social codes. This dirty reality, however, is a much more accurate and powerful symbol of the American West than the myth that has replaced it. It reveals a world not of simple heroes, but of real people struggling to survive in a hostile world. And this, my friend, is the true story of the saloons of the Old West.